There would be many Disney-inspired games released on 8-bit systems, especially with the Sega Game Gear and Master System consoles, many of them being depicted off of movies of the time to capitalise on popular trends. But there would be those that would also be based off of the adventures of some of the oldest and yet most iconic Disney characters of all time, that would range from excellent experiences to a varying mix of adventures that wouldn't be considered as good. But there's definitely something here for everybody. So here we will be taking a look at many of these entries released especially on the Sega Game Gear, where we will look at some of the worst titles but yet also look at some of the best, to see how they influenced the growth of the console and how they became iconic entries within the genre of cartoon inspired games. Disney's The Little Mermaid was met with harsh criticism upon its release, often stating as one of the worst movie adaptations or Disney adaptations of video games ever made, due to its lackluster gameplay. While the graphics were decent, but the gameplay lacked variety and just felt very repetitive in terms of how it played. But on lesser powered systems, there would also be issues with the frame rates, as the game would become very sluggish and almost lag in some respects, slowing the game down entirely, which would also contribute to the negative appeal of the game. But mostly it was just criticised for its repetitive, unresponsive nature that just left it feeling like a poor attempt. But this was among a sea of other movie inspired games that looked good on paper but just didn't reach the mass appeal once released due to some of these issues, as there was elements in the game that could have been a lot better than what was seen in the final product, which is a pity. And it's clearly be seen on the likes of the Game Gear edition, but even later on it was reintroduced on the Master System in Brazil by Tectoy in 1996, and it was pretty much just a carbon copy of that experience with the same type of issues, and nothing was really changed in all respects, with maybe bar a few visual tweaks with the menus and certain visual systems. But other than that, the gameplay was very similar. That required you to explore each of the environments to find keys to open chests containing money and extra lives, so that you can progress throughout the story. But aside from that, the game really did offer very little else in all respects to it, apart from some of the environments that you'll explore later on in the game. But due to the complexity of the difficulty and just the repetitive style nature of the gameplay, it just didn't leave for a lasting or worthwhile experience. And it was reflective in its reviews, stating it to be one of the worst games of this kind ever made at that time, which is a pity. Now, if you're a fan of the iconic movie, then you can have a look at it for sure, but ideally for most others, it wouldn't suit everybody and might be best avoid it. TaleSpin would be a platforming game that would act as a spin-off to the popular cartoon TV series seen at that time in the early 90s, that would see releases on the Sega Genesis, the Game Gear, and also on the TurboGrafx 16. They would allow you to play as a variety of different characters from the TV show. Each of the games act as a platforming style adventure, but would differ in terms of various characteristics. But the game would be met with mixed reception upon its release, as there were certain elements of the game that just felt lackluster and uninspiring. While it did have some distinctive quirks around them, more so on the likes of the Genesis and TurboGrafx editions, they would have been the better renditions of the game. But with the Game Gear version, it was very lackluster. It didn't have great graphics, and it just felt underwhelming to say the least, as you really did not know what you were supposed to do. Now, you could choose between different characters, but in most regards, because there was puzzle elements and you had to collect different items, it was hard to really know what to do, and in most cases it'd be very difficult to try and even complete the first level in the game. As you were exploring, you get so far and then there was little else knowing what to do. Like, even when you completely acquired, or when you thought you acquired every item that you needed to get, you still couldn't progress. You couldn't really do anything. It wasn't apparent as to what you actually needed to do. And in some cases, when you ventured into certain elements of the level, you couldn't really get back to the start, which also hindered the experience. So I don't know whether that was a glitch or whether that was just intentional for the game. But the Game Gear version is definitely not the version that would be recommended to play. If anything, it's definitely one of the worst Disney spin-offs of these type of games seen on any of these systems, and it's probably best avoid it, as it just doesn't really have much going for it, both graphically or even play wise. It just is very repetitive and just lackluster, to say the least. Bonkers Wax Up is a platform adventure game released on the Game Gear in 1995 and would later be ported then to the Master System by Tectoy in Brazil in 1998. That takes on the role of a popular Disney character based off of the iconic TV series, where you're tasked with completing a variety of different missions that take you from anywhere around museums where you have to find specific items and resources to open world style environments depending on the version that you're playing, because the game was released on other systems that would see you playing a variety of mini games, like from light gun style shooters even to drive and top down, almost Grand Theft Auto style gameplay with the likes of cars from an over the top perspective to complete a variety of different missions. But on the Game Gear that wouldn't be the same case. It would consist of mainly just platforming elements, but would mix up some dynamics, but wouldn't have the variety of gameplay of other editions. But the game was met with mixed reviews across the board, stating that they liked the idea and the visuals behind the game, but there was a lot of lackluster elements with regards to the collisions, the graphics, and even some of the gameplay features, stating that the game would often suffer from multiple slowdowns as you played, depending on certain elements that would appear on the screen, which definitely hindered the experience. The 8-bit versions didn't meet up to the reception, essentially, and would struggle to meet with certain elements. If anything, if you spend time playing it, even from the very first level, especially on the Game Gear, where you have to roam around a different mansion where you're trying to jump over different types of platforms to try and not fall off the screen, you have to avoid various enemies, collect loads of different types of items and resources in order to progress to get to the end point. But it just gets very repetitive. The levels are overly long, way longer than they need to be, and you find yourself going through the same type of environments over and over and over again, and you'll find yourself very quickly just losing interest. And that's the problem with a lot of these games, is that the variety behind the ideas really don't live up to the context of what the game was trying to do, as you're just presented with very repetitive style of gameplay that really won't appeal to every player. And for that reason alone, you can see why it got mixed reviews and why people often overlooked it in most regards. If you want to play a better version of this game, you would be better to play it on the likes of the Super Nintendo or more powerful systems, as it will provide a lot more variety. Mickey's Ultimate Challenge is a very different style of adventure platforming game that was originally released in 1994 on different systems with the Genesis, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, Game Gear, and was later added to the Master System in Brazil by Tectoy in 1998. That would see you take on the role once again of Mickey Mouse, where you had to complete objectives within the castle that you were situated in, and you had different type of game modes that you would need to work with to complete a variety of tasks in order to progress. Now, this was a very different experience compared to previous games with the likes of Castle of Illusion and the like, as the game was a lot more slower paced. You didn't really have enemies as such to defeat, but there was a lot more interactive elements with mini games where you had to play like memory games, or in some cases you would go into a room with Donald Duck performing spells. You would actually be shrunk down to like almost to an insect level, and you had to complete another variety of mini games in order to get back to normal. So the whole game essentially is a massive interactive puzzle game. Every interaction forms some sort of puzzle that must be completed in order to progress. Now, it won't appeal to everybody, but it will appeal to a select few, and there's a different take on this style of game. Some of the puzzles are pretty straightforward, but some of them are very, very challenging, and they're not really that apparent, and they don't give you great instructions as to what you need to do to complete them, so that can also add to the frustration. But for what it does offer, it's something different, but it's not the best game of its type. There are better games out there on these systems that you should try out, but if you're a fan of these earlier adventure games from Disney, it is one that you can look at for sure. The Jungle Book is another Disney-inspired game that was met with mixed reception upon its release, stating that many of the editions of the game having multiple flaws and just distinctive elements that made for a very frustrating and sometimes awkward gaming experience. Now, it's not to say that they're overly bad, but they can be quite repetitive and just overly difficult to say the least. The 16-bit entries with the Genesis and the Super Nintendo would have received the best reviews, and often stating that they were the best versions of the game to play. But the game was also released on the likes of the NES, Sega Master System and Game Gear, and they're okay games for what they try to represent, but they can be overly difficult with poor combat elements, even level design in most regards, as a lot of them suffer from the similar formula with regards to platforming design, with overly long and almost impossible jumps that you need to make, and in some cases with destructive environmental elements such as bridges or platforms that disappear. In some cases, when you go through some of the levels, especially on the Game Gear version, there's certain points where you have to collect like crystals in order to progress, and you need to collect a certain number of them. But at some points in the level you have to go and jump on top of destructive elements in order to reach some of those crystals. But in order to get to that, you have to make very long jumps, and in some cases there's certain sections, especially even on the first level, where sometimes some of those destructive elements don't even appear on screen at all. You either have to die or reset the game to get it to spawn. So there's an inherent glitch with some of these elements in the game. And even in some cases, what I found from playing this version of the game, that even if you did die and restart the level, that destructive element doesn't reappear at all. You nearly have to restart the entirety of the game or reset the console in order to get it to work, which is more of a faff, more of a nuisance more than anything else. So that will also contribute to the frustrative elements of the game. Now, I owned the Master System version growing up, and I did finish it. I put a lot of time into it, and I did like certain elements of it. There was certain parts of the game that I really did enjoy, but there was also very distinctive elements that I also found to be extremely repetitive and just overly barren to a point that you just didn't find it enjoyable. In many cases, even going back to years gone by, you'd find it a slog and you just were tired of it, and you just wanted to get the game over with, because you find the same elements just kept repeating themselves, and the same glitches and same issues just kept cropping up every so often, and it really did not leave for a worthwhile experience at all in many regards. So the chances are, if you did finish the game even today, it's highly unlikely that you'll probably want to go back to play it again, if at all. I don't want to say that it's an entirely bad game. There are elements of it that are decent, but there are better versions or examples of the game available on more powerful systems that you should try out. Hooks were released on multiple systems in the early 90s, with many different type of varieties of games being made available depending on the systems that you had access to. If you had access to the more home computer style platforms with the Amiga, Atari ST and MS-DOS systems, you would have access to an adventure point and click game, but other editions with the likes of the arcade and Super Nintendo versions would see you playing from an arcade beat 'em up style perspective, whereas all other gameplay formats would see the game being played out from a side-scrolling platform and action game. So there was a complete different variety of games at your disposal depending on which one you wanted to play or that you had access to at the time. Now, they all varied and differed in quality, some games being better than others, but there was enough variety there to pick and choose what you wanted or didn't want to play. With the 8-bit versions, they were decent in some respects. Mind you, they were tough and they did have the flaws and gripes. They could be very, very difficult. Some of the main gripes with the collision detection, even with the enemy placements, making it extremely difficult, dying so many times before you'd get a good run at the game. Because the game itself, the character, could be very, very slow to use, and that often contributed to poor reaction times when interacting in combat with enemy types, where you'd more often take hits than deal damage to enemies, which also contributed to the overall difficulty and frustration to many. And this would contribute in the reviews that the game got across the board, as it was a mixed bag. Now, it's not to say that they're a bad series of games. If anything, they're among the better series of movie adaptation games that were ported to games consoles, but they do present a varying mix of quality across the board. But they are worth experiencing just to see each of the versions alone and see how they contribute to the grand scheme of the movie and what they like to play. And the Game Gear version is no different in that respect, but if you've played the Master System version, there really is no difference, as technically these two games are the carbon copy of each other. But they are worth checking out just for fans of the movie alone. The Lion King, as we all know, is one of the most iconic Disney movies ever created, and even with the video game adaptations of the movie was also met with much acclaim, although they did have their gripes, regardless of the systems that you played them on, as visually they were stunning across the board. Whether they be on 16-bit systems or 8-bit systems, they looked very, very good and played quite well, but often had issues with the unbalance of difficulty regarding certain elements of the games, as the difficulty could increase almost to the point that in many cases the game could be almost unbearable unbearable to play, especially at later points in the game, which will force you to retry multiple times in order just to progress through a certain point, which also led to the frustration of many. But in saying that, the game was also met with high reception and sold in crazy numbers across the board on all systems, and is considered to be definitely one of the best movie conversions to video games of the time, and one of the most visually stunning, especially on 16-bit systems, that are worth a try. Deep Duck Trouble, starring Donald Duck, was released on the Sega Game Gear and Master System between the years of 1993 and 1994, and would be met with much praise regarding various elements within the game, as it acts as a platforming adventure game in the same vein as the likes of Mickey Mouse Castle of Illusion and other games like it, where you have to complete objectives, look for items of interest, and you have your own distinctive story and map locations to explore throughout the game. So the goal of the game is that you have to return an artifact that was taken by your uncle Scrooge McDuck that has put a curse on him, so you have to return it to its resting place in order to break the curse. So that will bring you to a variety of different locations. Now the game is challenging. It has some really nice graphics and details considering they're on 8-bit systems. It's definitely one of the better looking of these style of games, but they are tough, make no mistake about that. If you've ever played The Lucky Dime Caper, also starring Donald Duck, that was released on the Master System, that is another good but very, very difficult game. So these type of games are just tough to say the least, but they got good reviews in the magazines, proving to be quite popular among fans. But they're not without their flaws. They are challenging, they're tough, but the one thing I found, especially with the Game Gear version of this game compared to the Master System version, is that at certain points on some of the levels there will be instances of severe slowdown and frame rate issues that stop the game from running smoothly, so that can somewhat hamper the experience. But if you can overcome that and you understand how the game works, you will have a good experience. But just be mindful that these games are tough, they're not easy at all. But if you're a fan of this style of game, Deep Duck Trouble is one I think you should look at for sure. Legend of Illusion, starring Mickey Mouse, was released on the Game Gear in 1995 and would later be added to the Sega Master System in Brazil in 1998. That would allow you to reprise the role of the iconic Disney character, to defeat a dark shadow that has taken over the land, and it is your job to bring harmony and peace back to the realm and save the kingdom. Now, this is a very different style of game compared to the previous outings when we look at the likes of Castle of Illusion and even Land of Illusion, as they are considered to be among two of the best platform and adventure games on the Sega Master System or on 8-bit consoles. This game does differ slightly, as you can't really defeat enemies in the same way by jumping on them like you would have done beforehand. You have to throw weapons at them this time around. Plus there's a lot more intricacy with regards to solving puzzles, as some of the puzzles can be quite difficult to understand effectively to know what to do, which can also contribute to some of the frustrating elements of the game, as it's not always apparent to figure out or know what to do at any given time. But it doesn't take away from the fact that it is still a solid experience. While it plays very differently and you do have different elements and areas to explore, and it has a lot of challenges, and it has some very, very good graphics like that seen in previous games, and it still is one of the better action adventure games seen on 8-bit systems, but wouldn't be as good as the previous two outings. But it's still another game worth looking at. The Lucky Dime Caper, starring Donald Duck, was met with much praise once it was released between the years of 1991 and 1992 on both the Sega Game Gear and Master System, and was considered one of the better Disney games on those systems, that allowed you to play as the iconic Disney character, playing through a variety of different levels where you have to save your nephews that have been kidnapped. And the game plays from a very similar style to that seen in Mickey Mouse's Castle of Illusion, but at the same time is also a lot more difficult. If you have played the games, there's a variety of different levels available that take you across different types of locations, all with their own challenges and enemies to encounter. But make no mistake, this is one tough game. I played it over the years, mainly on the Sega Master System, and there are some subtle differences on the Game Gear, but yet is equally as difficult in all respects to it. So you have to collect loads of different resources resources and stars to not only give you more health points so that you can take more damage, but it will also allow you to speed up your attack patterns, because you would use a mallet or different types of weapons like frisbees, and will allow you to attack it more frequently and much faster, which will definitely help you, especially later on in the game. But if you gradually start to take damage, everything starts to slow down, and that can also hinder your progress. But also the attack patterns of some of the enemies can be quite unpredictable, which also can lead to the frustration. But these older games were like that anyway. They were always very unpredictable in how they played out. Like, it is a good solid game, a very, very tough game, very challenging game, make no mistake about that. Definitely one of the better Disney renditions on consoles, because it has great graphics, great visuals, great sound design, but just extremely tough and very, very frustrating. But if you put time into it, it's definitely one of the better and more worthwhile experiences that you can have of this game on these systems. When we look at the success of Disney's Aladdin, the iconic movie that was released in the early 90s, it was always inevitable that the game was going to see some sort of adaptation in the video game realm. And the game would see release on a multitude of different consoles, with the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Game Gear, Master System, among a few others. And they were all met with high reception upon their releases, stating them to be among some of the best movie or Disney depictions ever seen on consoles. And also with some of the most stunning visuals seen in video games of the time, especially more so on 16-bit consoles, as they're among some of the best ever seen during that generation. But we can't take away from the fact that the 8-bit versions of these games are also as good, and they really have to push the boundaries of those lesser powered consoles. With the 16-bit versions, they do play very differently, as they're more action focused. The 8-bit renditions, however, do have some action elements in it, but there's more fast-paced platforming action where you're avoiding traps, interacting with different puzzles, and there's not as much combat in it compared to its more powerful counterparts. But that doesn't take away from the fact that they're bad. If anything, they're not. They're equally as good. They're just a different style to what you would see on other consoles. Even when we look at the 8-bit editions, the Game Gear version itself stayed on top of the sales charts for 3 months straight in 1994, and even in the UK becoming one of the top selling games of the year. So that will tell you how popular this series of games was across the board. It's definitely one of the best out there. It's one of the best movie to game transitions ever made in many respects. It takes many of the elements from the iconic movie and adapts it very well to the gaming realm. So they are worth a look at, regardless of which version that you play as. They're definitely an enjoyable experience. Land of Illusion, starring Mickey Mouse, was released in 1993, and the game follows in the same footsteps as Castle of Illusion that was released in 1990. While it doesn't really have any direct connections with Castle of Illusion, or even the later game that would have been released on the Sega Genesis with World of Illusion, which is also another excellent game. But this is still a really good outing that also received much praise and reception with regards to reviews upon its release. And like Castle of Illusion, is also one of the better, if not being among the best platformers seen on the Master System and the Game Gear itself, as it just stuck with the same formula that just worked for Castle of Illusion and just added it to this. Now, there is debates of which version is considered the best, but most people often consider Castle of Illusion to be the best version of the game, which I can definitely agree on. But that doesn't take away anything from Land of Illusion. It is an excellent solid title, and definitely one of the best of its kind on the system. Whether you're playing on the Master System or the Game Gear, they're both very similar in how they play out, but they're just a really good series of games. If anything, these two games, even with World of Illusion on the Sega Genesis, among a couple of others, but these ones here are definitely considered to be among the best Disney games ever released on Sega consoles, and they definitely are worth checking out, 100%. Castle of Illusion, starring Mickey Mouse, was highly praised when it was released on multiple systems in the year of 1990. That would become one of the best platform and adventure games of its era, that allowed you to take on the role of Mickey Mouse on a quest to save your girlfriend Minnie Mouse from the evil witch Miserable, that sees you entering into a castle where you have to explore many environments, solving puzzles, defeating enemies and bosses so that you can progress in order to save Minnie. For its time, it was one of the highest reviewed reviewed games on the Sega Master System and even the Game Gear alike. And there was also a version of the game released on the Sega Genesis. It was also considered equally as good. But when we compare the versions, the Sega Master System version is often considered to be the definitive version of all of these games. As I myself grew up playing this game, and I played and put a lot of hours into it, and I can definitely highly attest to that. For me, this is one of the best platforming games ever on that console, hands down. And to prove how popular it was, the game itself got a full-on remake on modern systems back in 2013 on the likes of the PlayStation Network and the Xbox Live Arcade. So that'll tell you how good this game really is, and even by today's standards, it's quite possibly the best Disney-inspired game ever released on any system. There's a great use of graphics, visuals, sound design, with a great use of gameplay dynamics and challenging aesthetics, as this game is very, very tough, but also very, very rewarding and very addictive at the same time. Now, it's not without its flaws, because again, it is challenging, but it's definitely one of the best platforming depictions of any of these style of games ever seen during that period. And like I said, it quite possibly is the best Disney game ever seen on the Master System or any of these Sega consoles, even to this day. So it is highly recommended that you check it out. It pretty much is considered as one of the best games of all time in all respects to it. If you've watched up until this point of the video, you've seen the best and yet the worst of the Disney depicted games that the Game Gear had to offer. There are a varying mix of titles, some of them being among some of the best seen on 8-bit consoles, while some of them also classed as the worst. But there is something for everybody, regardless of what way you look at it. Now, for me personally, I genuinely don't like to hate on many of these titles, as I played a lot of them growing up, and yes, while they're not as good in many respects, they definitely hold some special memories to a lot of us, because we would have played and put a lot of time into them over the years. So they are deserving of some level of respect. But with that being said, there are many other unusual, quirky and iconic games from different franchises that were released on Sega consoles, which we do need to look at in more detail. And you can learn more about that in this next video, that will look at how these games evolved and created new generations on later consoles.